Hi, Chris Duff over at Serious Land Capital, vacant land funding partner. Today I wanted to go over a deal we're currently working on in Washington State. Interestingly, the seller has the property via a tax deed that was only transferred over into his name 3 years ago. So usually when tax deeds are that recent, it really varies state by state, but general rule is like within the last 4 to 5 years for most states, you're going to have to either do a suit to quiet title or utilize tax title services as an alternative to pursuing that suit to quiet title. So tax deeds are really harken back to when we first got into the land industry. The individual we learned from acquired almost all of his properties at tax auctions in Florida and, basically self-sold everything, a lot of it via owner finance. And, once we got into the game, well, first off, this was late 2019, early 2020, and very quickly, a lot of those tax auctions lost all of their alpha and properties were just selling for basically market value. You couldn't figure out the margin anymore. Plus, it's not a very efficient system because you have to, DD hardcore all of these properties because, you show up to the auction, you have to front cash if you win it. So if you're even slightly off on your DD, you could be buying a lemon, but you have no idea who the other bidders are. So you could end up, and most of the time it was, you end up doing a ton of extra legwork for properties that just end up getting bid up higher than you'd expect. It ends up being a pretty inefficient system that we quickly pivoted away from, but we really focused on that tax auction sale initially. But the problem was, a lot of these were cheaper properties. And again, the folks who are working with, it would generally be self-close situations, sometimes cash deals, sometimes owner finance. But, if you try to go through a title company, they're like, hey, we can't actually transfer this because it's a tax deed. And at least within Florida, again, it was like that 4 years need to pass from the time of acquisition of a tax deed in order for the title to be considered clean. Otherwise, you have to go through a suit to quiet title or just transfer via quitclaim deed. It's not marketable title. And so we ran this issue a few times. The individual we're working with was not the most savory individual. That's a story for another time. But, he was doing a lot of these off market, self-closed sales, either owner finance that could take years to sell. Usually he would try to close everything out from seller finance within 2 years, I think, on average. I don't know. It's been a while, been 5 years. Or cash deals, okay, transferring it over. But, if the other individual buying it ever wanted to try to sell it again, like it's not really clean title. So it was not the best setup. So ultimately, whenever we would come across tax deeds, it's like, okay, there has to be a way. We either have to bake in the time and the cost to do a suit to quiet title, or tax title services will provide an alternative to basically quiet title so that marketable title can be presented. And initially, even 5 years ago, TTS, tax title services for short, was only available in a few states. Now they're nationwide. So, it's just a go-to whenever these situations may arise. And they have different fees depending on the state. And usually, between like $1,500 to $2,500 at the higher end for their service. So I'm always trying to account for that just in case, a tax deed situation arises, because, if we acquire the property, we need to sell it, and we're not going to be doing self-closes. Like everything that we go after tends to be more expensive. And this particular property, it looks like the seller had already tried to sell it at one point too and wasn't able to get clear title. So like he needed somebody, he's under a cash crunch situation, plus, somebody else going to come in and try to clear this up. And being kind of hardball about the contract, is only giving us 30 days. Otherwise, you said, okay, I'm going to raise the price by 5K, the longer you guys take. But when we reached out to TTS, I actually hadn't worked with them prior. And Seth Williams at Marty Tipster podcast, he interviewed one of the founders or one of the lead principals at TTS a while ago, maybe a few years ago, if you want to check out more info about them. Really interesting service. It does take a little bit of time. So on average, it takes 30 to 45 days for them to run their process to effectively clear title. Or you can add a rush service for an extra $400 to bump the timeline to clear title within 30 days. Or at least they can't necessarily make any guarantees about that, but they just, they prioritize the route to go through. Plus you have to throw down a deposit. There's always going to be some work here. So there are no firm guarantees. And I know they mentioned, at least back on that podcast with Seth, that sometimes they can't fully uncover whatever is needed to clear title. Again, I'm using some vague terms here, but I think their rate of success is well over 90%. So it's a safer service most of the time, but you don't pay more than, I think, your $750 deposit if they're not able to solve the title. So, there's an inherent risk when doing this. That's why, with this seller, he's asking for $3,500 initially, non-refundable EMD. We're no way, not until we understand title it can be cleared here. Plus we're still doing our DD, but we can do it refundable, fine. And plus we got him to bump the kind of harsher closing timeline before price goes up to 45 days, because I was not familiar from TTS's side is that they don't actually provide the full closing service. They're just clearing title, and then they'll have a local contact at another title company or attorney's office who then takes all the work that TTS did to then prep final closing documents for the point of acquisition. But then you have to pay their title fees as well. So it's almost like a double hit there. So that's why you have to be really careful. If you have a tax deed type of acquisition or potentially even sale, if you had acquired tax deed on your own, if you can't put it on the buyer or whatever, then it's going to be a more expensive and time consuming closing process, because again, you have to account for 30 to 45 days on average for TTS to do their work, plus the time it'll take for the other title company to actually wrap up theirs. It should be a relatively quicker turnaround, because all basically the title commitments prepped on TTS's side. So then title company just needs to run through, maybe review your company docs or whatever to prep the finalization. But conservatively, I would still bake in another 2 weeks to actually prep the close. You got to make sure you arrange your docs in that way. That's why I was having the originator who brought us this deal go back and try to renegotiate so that it could buy us more time, because I just didn't see any possible route, even doing rush service, to conservatively close within 30 days from the point of contract signing. So we had to rework some things. Yeah, sometimes you just got to be creative. That's what these LLM models are here for too. You can just prep legalese really quickly based on some basic parameters. But that's how we arranged it, and currently trying to set up. Plus TTS, they'll ask for the tax deed, or at least a copy of it if available. So that's something to note as well there. Usually a lot of title companies, they won't be asking for anything like that, but that was an unusual request. But again, these guys are specialists. As far as I'm aware, the only title company that does anything like this in the country. So they've carved out a particular niche for themselves. So that's just to update you as far as how we've handled this side of the deal. And again, seller he was just another story. And then he was asking to do a 72-hour right of first refusal for if we can't close in 45 days, that if he receives another offer within that 3-day period, we would either have the chance to fully close out at our original purchase price, or he could move on and not be restricted for us purchasing again. But it's such a weird request, because obviously we would have closed as soon as we could get clear title on it. It's just, we have to run through this process. And we try to explain, hey, you got a tax deed here. It's just not as easy. But I'm I think the risk of that is pretty low, and that we could get all of this done within 45 days. Yeah. Sometimes with these sellers, and they're loose cannons, if they ask for weird requests, sometimes like I just have to weigh the pros and the cons. Like, okay, are we getting the better end of the deal here, which to me was extending the harsher penalties from 30 days to 45 days. And I'm like, okay, if you ask for some other stuff, fine. We'll figure it out if it gets closer to there, and we'll have a lot more info by that time anyway. But again, sometimes you just got to play the game and figure out, okay, what's acceptable or not, or what are some of these paper tiger clauses that might be thrown into contracts that probably won't come back to bite us. So with that in mind, it looks like we can solve this one. Plus, we're trying to line up a builder buyer. Even the first one we talked to, it seems likely they're going to come in at like over a $200K purchase price. Like, it's a nice piece of land. It could be close to like a 3x exit based on the purchase price, which would be pretty incredible. Again, in this market, try to line up. We wouldn't be able to do a double close situation because the timeline for builder feasibility in relation to what we're trying to do from the seller side and that tax deed involvement. Like, I want to close first before doing anything with the builder and avoid being snaked with the deal. But it's possible to get some equity upside in a near double close situation by lining up a presumptive buyer prior to even purchasing on our side. That's always my preferred way to go about things whenever possible, especially, again, in an overall more difficult, volatile macroeconomy. I know things have calmed slightly, a little bit compared to a month ago, but I would still be very cautious out there. And that's what the larger players are still doing. So with all that in mind, seriousland.capital for any of your funding needs. Zero cost review of your land deals at Land Daily Diligence Facebook group. Just got off one of those sessions just now. And landpricer.ai for the most simple and accurate way to price land. Was getting a lot more work on those prompts. Really getting comfortable there. Couldn't be more excited for what we're able to present to you all here ASAP. Just got to keep after it. Subscribe and share. Also, Unconference, Dave Deniston, landunconference.com, $200 off your ticket using my last name. Hope to see you there before tickets are gone. Bye.